Biological approach to gender. Right, I'm going to run through an essay for you. You don't have to use these particular points, but you know they will work and you can learn most of it if you like, but really try and think about what you're writing, because if you're trying to learn it completely word for word, that's going to take you an awful lot of effort, and you don't need to do that. You just need to understand each point and understand the structure. Okay, so here we go. Describe and discuss. And this is going to be a very similar format. You've already had a look at this with one of the other, or you should have had a look at it with one of the other videos, but I'm just going to run through for the biological to prepare you for this test. So as you know, we start off with point. So what's our point? We're going to say our point here is that the biological, what does the biological theory think? Because you're comparing it with all the other approaches and what they think. So you need to state very clearly and precisely using terminology. A lot of you are still incredibly waffly, and it's almost like you've never studied psychology. You've got to learn some of these key words, okay, and use them. So biological theory believe that gender is innate, right? We know what that means. It means we're born with it. So we have to develop that point. We're going to explain it. So our second key area is explain. Point, explain, evidence, and evaluate further down. So explain it. In other words, that anatomy is destiny. From conception, we're set on the road to becoming male and female, but that also means they believe we become masculine and feminine, right? So our chromosomes, XX for females, for a typical female, XY for a typical male. And they're saying that is set in stone. Once that's set in, you will also become appropriately masculine or feminine. Whatever evidence have they got to support this? Well, we've got loads of different bits and bobs. But let's start with this, maybe. You don't have to use this, you could use a different area. But let's say evidence for this comes from studies like atypical studies. So, for example, here a man with Klinefelter's syndrome, for example, has a chromosome pattern XXY. Notice I'm saying a male, not someone with Klinefelter's. We're trying to be precise. Male with Klinefelter's. Chromosome pattern, what it is, all right, to try and get the mark. Psychologists are interested in whether this pattern affects gender behaviour, and in fact evidence shows that there are physical differences between these males and typical male pattern, for example feminine type breasts, but also, to be honest, more interestingly for us, psychological differences, things like higher gender confusion, poor verbal skills. Okay, the thing is, we want to evaluate. Our next thing is evaluating it. And again, remember, we're trying to signal, we're trying to flag up to the examiner, signposts, whatever you want to call them, to the examiner that you're now making an evaluative point. So make sure you practice that. So one evaluation point for this is if chromosome pattern determined our psychological gender, then all males of, all males of XY pattern, should behave in a masculine way, and that's clearly not the case. Okay. So you could say that we have a whole range of typical males, XY, but their gender behaviour can really vary. So very aggressive, very competitive, etc., to really very gentle and passive. So you could develop that point. These are just kind of starting you off on the points, and you could develop them a little bit. So we could then go on we could start with another point, but actually I'm quite happy with this. I've got loads to say here. So I might bring in another piece of evidence. For the biological explanation comes from hormonal research. One area to support this idea is that altering hormones will affect gender behaviours, and that comes from animal research. So here much work has been done, for example, by injecting female animals with male hormones like testosterone to see what results. The evidence clearly shows that increasing testosterone makes female animals behave more like males. For example, and now we get to the bit more precision, Beach, all right, that's the name of the research, it showed female bitches to urinate like male dogs. And a different research, but where they were using hamsters. You've got it on your handout. Male hamsters injected with estrogen behave more passively and gently. So we can throw that in. Now, a problem with this, and when we're using the evaluative points, we're trying to build on whatever evidence, whatever you've said before. So a problem with this is that these are animals, and that although there are similarities between them and the human brain, they're still different from us, and we're limited to generalizing. So there we go, for generalizing these key phrases, key words, generalizing from them to humans, or generalizing from that sample to humans. That would be even better. Okay. So it's better to use human research. For example, Van Goosen's work on transsexuals awaiting gender reassignment. Problem though with and maybe you might want to just put in a tiny bit more, but it depends on how your time's going, etc., etc. And we would definitely put in a validator point there. We've got a couple of really good ones with Van Goosen. Again, we've got the problem that this was an atypical sample. These were people who already were waiting to transgender. They were waiting to change sex, and therefore they are different to the majority, different to the typical male or female out there, and therefore we are limited again in generalizing. So we could have that. We could also have their expectations. That might be a better one because we used samples before, but their expectations they were desperate to change. They were desperate to feel more masculine or feel more feminine, depending on which way they were transgendering, and therefore there is this expectation. What they wanted to feel was a bit more aggressive or less aggressive or whatever. Okay, so we could include things like that. Third area of support comes from differences in brain structures. I would try and slip that in if I were you. The SDN of a male transsexual is larger than SDN of a male transsexual or a female, and those are the same size. So therefore the evidence there is suggesting that there's some physical cause already in the brain that's making somebody feel male or female. You could also throw in money and Batista. My worry with that is that if you start on money, you're going to retell me the story. It's such a waste of time. Okay, you don't want to do that. You just want to pick out a tiny bit of information that's relevant. And that's why I'm putting money and Batista down here, because I know what most of you would do. You retell the story. So there are also counter-arguments, though, and this is key. We've put in some evaluation. We need to throw in a bit more. For example, point. Okay, so we're going to start off again with our point. Others argue that environmental influences influences gender. So, for example, the way our parents shape us. This can be explained by the behaviourist. Remember, shaping is more behaviourist. We're going to bring in SLT in a moment. It's a behaviourist idea of reinforcing gender-appropriate behaviour. What evidence have we got? Okay, there's our explain here. Let's write that in. Okay, because I didn't do that. So if you want just to remind yourself to explain evidence here, we put in our evidence. Okay, so evidence for it comes from studies like Faggot, 24 families. We want a tiny bit of information to tell the examiner. We don't want to retell the whole thing. 24 families, observed them for 5 separate hours. And what they found was that parents did reinforce sex-appropriate, gender-appropriate behaviour. Okay, so, and they were quite, what was the word they used? It wasn't aggressive, but they were a bit unforgiving with gender inappropriate behaviour. Okay, the problem is, we've got problems with that research. These were only 24 families. Also, the fact, so therefore you've got a limited sample and you're limited in generalising. But we've already made that point, so it's better for you not to waste too much time on that and come on to a different one. Something like the fact that these families were aware that they were being observed, and therefore they would behave differently. Remember, we call that demand characteristics. So we can put in things like that. Other arguments from biological come from, here we go again, another point, social learning theory. We're raising something, we're identifying a problem, alternatives, right? Explaining that. What do we mean by SLT? Well, their belief is that we observe role models and we copy them when it seems right to do so. Where's the evidence that this goes on? The evidence comes from things like Mead's research. All right, very brief, do not retell the 3 tribes. We don't need to know that, okay? We may just put in one tiny bit of information, like one of the tribes. That's it, nothing else. So going on then to evaluate it. Unfortunately, Mead was criticised. Look at some of these words we need to say for observer bias. Why? She was a feminist. She wanted to prove things. She was criticised for interpreting what she saw in that particular light. Okay, being very subjective. So again, some of you writing quite waffly answers to these. No inter-observer reliability because she's on her own. Those are the key words they want to see. Another problem from social learning theory comes from the fact that, what about kids who behave atypically, but they have parents who are very typical and stereotypical in their gender behaviour? Where on earth do they learn that from? So that's another argument. So you could bring in, if you want to, that some say that biological approach is too reductionist. Make sure you explain it. Oversimplistic, explain it. And finally, there are alternatives. Freud, for example, but there's a problem with Freud. You could then go on to cognitive, and I know we haven't covered that yet. So there it is in a nutshell. Very easy if you know what you're doing. Okay, so just make sure you've learnt a nice little structure for your test. Okay.